Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for our virtual program. And thanks to those of you who made a donation at registration. We're very grateful for your support and your support for these free virtual programs and the conversation and the dialogue that they produce. On Sunday, Americans will observe the nation's youngest federal holiday, Juneteenth, which was officially signed into law last summer by President Biden after Congress passed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act. We have a couple of wonderful people here to help us understand what Juneteenth represents, not only on a national level, but through a more local lens, to understand what emancipation looked like for enslaved individuals in Maryland. These are two wonderful colleagues and friends of the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and I'm very proud to introduce them to you today. We have Richard Bell, who is a professor of history at the University of Maryland. His most recent book, Stolen: 5 Free Boys Kidnapped into Slavery and Their Astonishing Odyssey Home, was a finalist for the 2020 George Washington Prize and the 2020 Harriet Tubman Prize. Stolen shines a glaring spotlight on the Reverse Underground Railroad, a criminal network of human traffickers who stole away thousands of legally free people of color from their families in order to fuel slavery's rapid expansion in the decades before the Civil War. Rick has held major research fellowships at Cambridge, Yale, and the Library of Congress, and is the recipient of the National Endowment of the Humanities Public Scholar Award. He also serves as a trustee of the Maryland Center for History and Culture and is a founding member of the University of Maryland's chapter of the University's Studying Slavery Consortium. Welcome, Rick. We're glad to have you on another program, and it's great to see you. Anthony Cohen is a historian, author, and explorer of the American past. An early purveyor of experiential history, Tony launched his career in 1996, walking 2 months from Maryland to Canada along one of the routes of the Underground Railroad, a secret route to freedom for American slaves. Tony is the founder and president of the Minare Foundation, a national nonprofit organization preserving the legacy of the Underground Railroad, and operates the Button Farm Living History Center, a 40-acre farm depicting 1850s plantation life in Maryland. Tony has served as a consultant to the National Parks Conservation Association, Maryland Public Television, NASA, among others, and trained Oprah Winfrey for her role as Setha in the 1998 motion picture Beloved. Tony is a founding member of the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project and is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Great Escapes: Journeys on Maryland's Underground Railroad, which will be released this fall. Welcome, Tony. Glad to have you here. So we're going to dive in. I think the way that this conversation will be framed is probably starting from a more national level and our understanding of Juneteenth as a holiday, and then we'll start to parse it down to the more local level, and then to understand what this means for us today. I'd like to encourage all of you to please utilize the Zoom functions, that is the chat and the Q&A box. I will be reserving some time at the end of the program to pull from that Q&A box and ask some questions for both Tony and Rick. But throughout the program, if something comes up and it's relevant, I will try and insert it in live time. So we're going to jump in. Until recently, I think relatively few people understood what Juneteenth represents. I think really since 2020, the holiday has had some more mainstream attention. Rick, would you be able to provide us with an overview of what the federal holiday commemorates?
Yeah, I can certainly try. And first of all, thanks to you, Martha, for organizing this event. It's a great pleasure to be sharing this virtual dais with Tony as well, whose work I've admired for a long time. And welcome to all of you out there in Zoom land as well. I see many familiar names from this community logging in. Good to be with all of you. what we commemorate on Juneteenth, this new federal holiday, which is only a year or so old, is something that's been commemorated by people who have not waited for federal recognition for quite a long time here. And that is something that happened very far from Baltimore, something that happened all the way down in Galveston, Texas, on June the 19th, 1865, when a Union commander, a U.S. Army commander, his name was General Gordon Granger, arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced and proclaimed, read from a script, a proclamation called General Order Number 3, announcing freedom from slavery in Texas, under the protection, of course, of the Union Army to enforce that proclamation. And that part of it is very important. As you all know, watching, more than 2 years earlier, let's roll back the clock from June of 1865 to January the 1st, 1863, Lincoln had signed a document known as the Emancipation Proclamation, which had decreed that Confederate slavery was no longer recognized, and it was the policy of the Union Army to liberate all enslaved people in rebel territory, which is a great and important thing, actually, to make the emancipation of enslaved people a goal of the Union war effort. But signing a piece of paper in Washington that is supposed to liberate 3.1 million enslaved people in the Confederacy, which believes itself to be a foreign country, is on the surface a pretty tokenistic gesture, a symbolic gesture. What matters is that the Union Army, the US Army, goes about enforcing that proclamation as it pushes into one rebel county after another, time and again over the next 2.5 years, bringing the breath of emancipation, bringing the destruction of slavery in Confederate territory with each new advance. So as they push into Vicksburg, Mississippi, July 1863, they're bringing the breath of emancipation with them. When General Sherman rampages through Georgia in whatever year that is, 1864, he's bringing the breath of emancipation with him. And when General Granger gets to the most remote of all the 11 Confederate states, Texas, that's what he's doing. He's bringing the breath of emancipation with him. So given that Texas is the last state where the Union Army, the US Army, penetrates, June 19th, 1865 is the last formal marker of a process that from the US government's perspective began on January the 1st, 1863 with that piece of paper, but it's the US Army that's been delivering upon that down payment, that promise. So that's what's being commemorated by this new national holiday, Juneteenth. It's the destruction of slavery within the Confederacy, especially by the US Army. And I'll just flag here, and I'll say more about this later on if I get the chance, that's of course not the full story. Enslaved people in those 11 Confederate states had been attacking slavery relentlessly themselves long before the US Army ever arrived. But Juneteenth commemorates the destruction of slavery in the Confederate states.
And so, Rick, I'm going to ask you to go just a little bit more in depth. So we're talking about a few different congressional laws and acts, not just the Emancipation Proclamation. Can you talk us through some of the others and tell us what they actually meant in practice for African Americans in the United States?
Yeah, I can certainly try, and I don't want to overwhelm folks with detail here. So just hold on to the big headlines here, which is that it's a process, right? It's a process. I want to remind folks that when Lincoln is elected in the fall of 1860, and he's the first anti-slavery guy to achieve the presidency in quite a long time, by the way, he is elected on a platform of stopping the spread of slavery into free soil territories out west. He's not elected on the platform of destroying slavery where it lawfully exists in the South. That's not why people voted for him or what they expected him to do or what he said he was going to do. And so nonetheless, to Southerners, Lincoln's election, the first anti-slavery president in a generation, is like Northerners have elected the devil incarnate. They lose their minds that Lincoln's been elected, even though he's a pretty moderate anti-slavery guy. Lincoln, by the way, never joined an abolitionist organization, never sheltered fugitives in his cellar. He is not Frederick Douglass. He is not John Brown. He is not Harriet Tubman. He's, and I don't mean this in any, I won't say it because I'll regret it after I say it. I was going to make a modern comparison, which I would immediately regret. So I'm not going to say that. Southerners secede because they fear he's the devil incarnate, that they fear that he is going to take their slaves as soon as he gets into office. And eventually 11 states secede as far north as Virginia, and there's concern for Lincoln and his friends that other slave states like Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware might break away too, that things could only get worse. And so Lincoln is very clear in his first year in office to say, I was not elected to take your slaves. I was elected simply to stop the spread of slavery. I'm not the guy you think I am, in part because he wants to get those 11 states back, and he doesn't want any more to secede. However, when the war begins and Lincoln's trying to launch a military campaign to drag those 11 states back into the Union, which is his goal, his aim, enslaved people see an opportunity, both in the Confederacy and in the border states. They see an opportunity that under the chaos of war, they can better escape enslavement while their enslavers are distracted and fighting each other. And maybe even they can persuade one of the sides, in this case, the Union, to offer them protection and some new guarantees they didn't have before. And that's the story of the Civil War. Enslaved people running away from their enslavers, becoming fugitives in large numbers and putting pressure on the Union Army to do something, to take them in, to protect them, to grant them asylum. And that doesn't happen at first. The Union commanders at the start of the war spend a lot of time trying to keep arriving Black fugitives out of their army camps. But that takes manpower, it takes attention, it requires Union troops to basically act as slave catchers. It's not a good look, and it's time-consuming and expensive. So one by one, Union commanders begin taking in these Black fugitives and putting them to work in non-combat roles, scouts and guides, things like that. And as more and more Black fugitives arrives at these camps, the Union Army has to have a policy to govern this de facto new program of letting them in. And that policy will produce legislation in the Congress. And the first law I'll very quickly mention, I'll go quickly, is the first Confiscation Act passed by Congress in 1861, which makes it US Army policy to welcome in Black fugitives into their camp and to guarantee them asylum for the course of the war. That will be followed by other major pieces of legislation in Congress. It's worth pointing out here that many of the Southern senators and congressmen who you'd think would be opposed to anything like this, they've left Washington. They've seceded from Washington politics, right? They've been kicked out of the Senate when they secede, and they've gone down to Richmond more often than not to be in the Confederate Congress. So the DC Congress has a large number of Republicans who have the votes to do things, and they do things. The next thing they do is in March of 1862, where Republicans in Congress abolish the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which is a pro-slavery law from a decade earlier, which has given slave catchers and slave holders in pursuit of fugitives extraordinary power. Congress says, let's get rid of that. It was a terrible law. In April of 1862, Republicans in Congress abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., because D.C. too has become a magnet for Black fugitives from slavery. It's functioned as a giant army camp. It's a giant magnet, and they don't want those Black fugitives to be immediately re-enslaved when they arrive in D.C. So they abolish slavery in D.C. In June of 1862, and I'll only do a couple more of these, in June of 1862, Republicans in Congress abolish slavery in the territories, not the states, but the territories out west. This is a big deal. It's the reason the Republican Party exists, and they get it done in June of 1862. In July of 1862, there's a second Confiscation Act, which says that those Black fugitives arriving at those camps will be granted permanent asylum and will be forever free of their servitude. In other words, Congress formalizes their emancipation. And then that same month in July, there's a Militia Act, which encourages those Black fugitives to strap on muskets and put on blue uniforms and become Union soldiers. And the next big development, and this is where I'll pause, Martha, will be the Emancipation Proclamation of January the 1st, 1863.
Thanks, Rick. I think that's a wonderful setup for Tony to maybe talk a little bit more about what's going on in Maryland at this time. So, Rick threw out some nearby, some neighbors and what's happening in those areas. But what I think people don't really understand is that Maryland was one of the earlier states to abolish slavery. Maryland's Emancipation Day is November 1st, 1864, which was a full year ahead of the 13th Amendment, but actually 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, Tony, if you could explain just what's going on in Maryland at this time and why and how Maryland's Emancipation Day is, where it's falling and what are the qualities or the things that are happening to create that.
Yeah, absolutely. So during the Civil War, Maryland remained neutral to a great extent, was forced to remain neutral and not secede, which of course was a critical point for the Union government. They did not wish to be surrounded by enemy territory. That would have hastened a different conclusion to the war, to be certain. But Maryland's sympathies, by and large, conveyed with the Confederacy. And many Marylanders of age and some who weren't even of age turned south and joined Confederate units. As Rick had mentioned, there was a number of things in the years leading up to Maryland's Act that kind of nudged it towards that end. Certainly, the Confiscation Act of 1861, probably one of the most well-known results was Field Order 15 in South Carolina, where we get 40 acres and a mule from. And so even before Lincoln had solidified in his mind the Emancipation Proclamation, he was frequently at odds with abolitionist generals in the field who were creating their own form of emancipation. But none of this failed to be seen by enslaved people themselves. And all of these actions were liberally discussed in newspapers across the country. And there's strong evidence were also being discussed around kitchen tables and slaveholders cursing the damn Yankees, and this information trickling down and making its way to the slave quarter. There's growing scholarship and documentation leading up to the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation that enslaved people across the South, sometimes referring to it as watch night, were waiting for this document to be signed. Some of that might be speculative. We're not quite sure, but knowledge of these movements affected everyone, including Maryland. Closer to home, as Rick mentioned, Congress abolishes slavery in the District of Columbia in April of 1862. And as part of that act, there was compensation to slaveholders for the loss of their property. It was not exclusively limited to DC slaveholders. If you were in the suburbs of Northern Virginia or Maryland, you could, and many did, also apply for compensation. I think you had to either have property holdings in the district, or your enslaved workers, you had to prove that they were actually employed in the district during the time, but you could get compensation. So like in my county, Montgomery County, Maryland, the Bell sisters in Rockville filed in a couple of claims, a total of, I believe, over $16,000 worth of claims for more than a dozen enslaved people. And so Marylanders are watching this happening. They're realizing as the tide is turning on the war and the Union is making gains, that the ultimate outcome of a Union win would be the abolition of slavery. And so eventually this makes its way to the ballot. Maryland becomes the first state to abolish slavery by popular vote. And that was even close. I believe it was Union troops who were garrisoned in Maryland who were permitted to vote in that referendum that pushed the number above the line for emancipation. And so November 1st, 1864, Maryland's Constitution produces, I believe it's 40 words, that hereafter in this state there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except in punishment of crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted. All persons held to service or labor as slaves are hereby declared free. Not much of a proclamation. I'm not sure we can call it that. But the deed was done. And then the aftermath.
And at this point, I'm going to pull in a question that just came in from someone in the audience. Lucy is asking if you might be able to discuss the reactions of those Maryland enslavers to the state's 1864 Emancipation Act. Lucy, is surmising that the circumstances didn't quickly improve for formerly enslaved people, and wondering how many of them might have continued to work for their enslavers, or what the next aspect of their life might have looked like with emancipation, as a law.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first to note that the change to the Constitution did not come with instructions. So there was no guidance on how this would manifest. I believe it was probably slaveholders in Charles County who were the first to actually organize. And I think it was within 2 weeks of the constitutional change, one or more public meetings was held, and they were discussing what to do, and voting on a shared upon agreed amount of wages that would be paid to former slaves, and discussed issues like housing and so forth and so on. Through the late 1860s, as evidenced in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established to hear the needs of formerly enslaved communities after the war. You find accounts, pleas to the Freedmen's Bureau from formerly enslaved people who still have children that are being held in bondage by unreconstructed former owners. So the problem continues to go on, for some time with no kind of top-down solution to some of the grievances. I'll also just say that leading up to the vote, it's important to know that Maryland was an open recruiting ground by the Union Army for enslaved people to join the ranks. Some served in place of their owners. Some were recruited independently. As Rick mentioned, with the District Act, slaves were pouring across the border. And with the non-enforcement of the Fugitive slave law, also pouring across the northern border. So the plug had been pulled from the drain, so to speak. And I think many slaveholders knew what the writing on the wall was, per se. So part of the win from the constitutional change was certainly from a percentage of the population that would have otherwise kept slavery, but was hoping that they might receive compensation for their so-called loss.
And I'm hearing some interesting dynamics with the army, the Union Army, and soldiers, and particularly soldiers of color, and what perhaps their influence might have been in, moving some of these laws forward. Can either of you speak towards that? There were some questions from our audience too, wondering about that. Confiscation Act and militia acts and enlistment acts. Would one of you be able to speak to kind of the dynamic of Black Union soldiers and how perhaps they impacted this movement?
Sure, I can say a few quick things. And before I do, I'll just draw folks' attention to a comment that just came through on the chat from our friend Charlie Mitchell, who knows what he's talking about. He says, many of those former enslavers relied on apprenticeship laws on the books that allowed them to forcibly apprentice Black children. They had only to convince a judge that Black parents couldn't care for their children. Charlie Mitchell, by the way, as many of you know, is the co-editor of a new book about all the topics we're talking about today. It's an edition of essays. I'm one of the contributors, but there's lots of great stuff in here. It's called The Civil War in Maryland Reconsidered. And one of the essays is by Jonathan White at Christopher Newport University, exactly about the destruction of slavery in Maryland specifically. So I draw your attention, folks, to Charlie's work and to Jonathan's work within it there. The role of Black soldiers in the Civil War is absolutely central to everything that happens, not least because the numbers involved are enormous. By the end of the war, we think about 179,000 African Americans serve in US forces in some capacity or other, typically in the US Army. About a third of them, by the way, give their lives, fall in the course of their military service, either in combat or disease, a huge loss of life. They see action in more than, I think, 400 battles and encounters and skirmishes. one of which, of course, was famously documented in the movie Glory, that I bet many of you have seen. I still like it, about the attack on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in 1863, which, even though the attack is unsuccessful, it reminds skeptical white Northerners that Black soldiers are just as brave, just as courageous, just as fortified for this war as white soldiers are. And beginning in 1863, and this is coterminous with the Emancipation Proclamation, Black enlistment becomes a major goal of the Union war machine, right? They need manpower to fight their enemy. And they also realize that to recruit from within the Confederate states, as the US Army penetrates down there, is also taking Black laborers out of the Confederate economy as well, which is doubly, therefore, important. So those Black soldiers, some of whom are former slaves from Virginia or Maryland, it doesn't really matter which side of the battle line they're from, and some of whom are free Black people, like the sons of Frederick Douglass, for instance, Lewis and Charles, contribute a major new phalanx of manpower, body of men, to the war machine. As you can imagine, they take particular delight in liberating enslaved people whenever they can, as they go southwards into the bowels of the Confederacy. Sometimes they take particular delight in destroying whipping posts and slave pens in the Deep South. On more than one occasion, it is a Black Union soldier who is whipping or administering corporal punishment to a recalcitrant white enslaver in parts of the South as well. So the world is turning upside down here rapidly. And so in addition to their military contributions, they're also driving forward the political debate, which is ongoing during and after the war, about what Black soldiers deserve, what they have earned by their extraordinary contribution to the Union war effort. And Black soldiers, who soon become veterans of the war after 1865, are, of course, demanding the full political rights of citizenship, regardless of whether they were free before the war or whether they were enslaved before the war. They want the vote, and they can point to their military service as the single most undeniable reason why they're entitled to that vote. So they are political actors at the same time they're essential military actors in this conflict.
Thank you. And I'm hearing kind of these, status changes, both perhaps as, becoming soldiers, but then certainly once emancipation happens, a new status for people of African descent. So, Tony, could you tell us what emancipation should mean and what in theory it means? And then maybe, we alluded to this a little bit with people whose children might have still been forcibly in apprenticeships and things like that. But what in theory is emancipation? And then what does it actually do for African Americans at this point? What changes? There seems to be a lot of gray area and a lot of ways that people can skirt some of these new legislation and new laws. So if you could just provide some context for that, that would be great.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, the concept of emancipation, whether that word was used or not, was nothing new at the time of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Acts of freedom or freeing people was part and parcel of the African American experience, and probably where a lot of individual energy and thoughts and hopes were pinned by every generation of enslaved people. Prior to the abolition of slavery, you could get your freedom one of two ways, essentially. By manumission, which was a legal process, freeing people by legal document or by hand manu. And the other was being born to a free woman of color. Almost all the slave states conferred the status of freedom or enslavement to the condition of the mother. So if a woman was free, her children would be free. If she was enslaved, her children would be enslaved. So those were like the two major ways. Separate from manumission was emancipation. And the best way to kind of describe that in theory is the images or of the statues in several places in our country. Here in Washington, D.C., Lincoln Park, there's a statue that depicts Abraham Lincoln with a enslaved man kneeling at his feet. Well, the man isn't quite kneeling. If you look at that tableau, you'll see shackles around his legs, which had been broken. And Lincoln, who appears to be putting his hand down over the man's body, is actually in the process of lifting his hand. He being the representative of government. It's the removal of the hand. And to the times that these tableaus were created, the thought was that once that man rises to his feet, he would be eye to eye on par with Lincoln. So that's what the Emancipation tableau means. But of course, still we rise. So just by signing a document, just by enacting a 13th Amendment might make people free on paper, but it certainly doesn't accomplish that in a wider social way. They're still, denied rights to citizenship and to voting, and even after those come in for like African-American men to vote, women of all stripes would not receive that right until decades later. And we're still fighting for those guarantee of those rights today. So it was a time of great uncertainty. And then, of course, it's followed by the Reconstruction era and the formalizing of Jim Crow laws. So there was a very, I would say, narrow window of hope when people could dream big at the end of the Civil War before new forms of control and dominance kind of codified what was there before, but in slightly different ways that met the legal requirements. So I'm not sure that emancipation in its fullest permutation has ever or yet been accomplished in Maryland, in America.
So as historians and educators both, I kind of want to bring this conversation to the present a little bit and talk about how the recent recognition of Juneteenth and emancipation is certainly exciting, but overdue and not new by any means. So what does this say, in your opinion? And I'd love to hear from both of you about the way that American history is taught and prioritized in classrooms, but also just like as a American narrative.
Shall I go first? I'm happy to go first. So, yeah, I would agree that this is long overdue. And I think that there is real appetite, real hunger out there among young people, most especially, to learn fuller, more complicated stories about America's past and how we came to be the country and the people that we are today. And we're doing no one any service by oversimplifying, by dumbing down, or by whitewashing American history. We're not arming the next generation with good citizenship skills if we're not telling them the truth about who we are and how we got here. I would say that first of all. Secondly, I think I'm grateful that Juneteenth is a federal holiday, which happened incredibly suddenly. We all remember how suddenly this happened, which is probably a testament to how little many of us, including myself, knew about how well known Juneteenth was amongst other segments of the population. By the way, if you want to learn more about the history of the holiday, Annette Gordon-Reed, a famous historian at Harvard University, Annette Gordon-Reed has a good book about growing up in Texas in the context of Juneteenth. The book is called On Juneteenth. Check it out. I think that if Juneteenth as a national holiday is getting us into events like this, where we get to talk about complexity and contingency and the role of enslaved people and free Black people in seizing freedom in the Confederacy and even in border states, then it's a wonderful new addition to our calendar and a great improvement on President's Day, which puts the spotlight solely on the heroic deeds of a couple of individuals, Washington in the Revolution and Lincoln in the Civil War. However, no holiday can be perfect. No holiday can do everything that historians and scholars will want from it. And so while Juneteenth is a good reminder that it took military action and federal government intervention to crush slavery in the Confederacy, by marking the arrival of Gordon Granger in Texas, the Juneteenth holiday doesn't shine a big enough spotlight on the role of enslaved people themselves in seizing freedom throughout the war, both in the Confederacy and beyond it, nor does it help us understand the destruction of slavery in Maryland or Delaware or Missouri and Kentucky, which were not affected by the execution of the Emancipation Proclamation by the U.S. Army. And then we still run the danger, and Tony alluded to this in his last answer, of patting ourselves all on the back for a job well done in 1865 and saying the job of fighting for racial justice is over, right? Because we got it all done in the Civil War. As Tony just pointed out, that really shines a spotlight on one set of events, which darkens a series of already dark events that begin with Reconstruction, which is a tragedy, and that continue through Jim Crow, through lynching, through segregation, through decades of sharecropping, through the war on drugs, through contemporary voter suppression efforts. We can never abandon what is an ongoing fight for the freedom of all Americans in this country.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And one of the interesting things, I think, there's maybe one way to look at Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday, and that is you get the holiday and then you learn about it. It's a learning opportunity. And I think it will be that to some extent in public education. But I think the Black Lives Matters movement, the death of murder of George Floyd, forced a greater and deeper kind of racial literacy on the general public. And forced is not the right term. But, people, I think for the past half decade have been seeking information to explain why these social ills that seem easily traced to the period of slavery are still with us and still prevalent, and if there's a deeper meaning. And so I think with that greater literacy, we have a greater opportunity for understanding. I mean, in a just bizarre way, even detractors, even people today who seem to profess a disdain towards all Americans having equity under our laws, they're pulling out things like critical race theory. I know a lot of historians of the African American experience, and I'm like, when was the first time you heard critical race theory? Answer, oh, when Tucker Carlson was mentioning it. Like, where did they get this stuff? So, that to say, we have more information at our fingertips. There's this greater literacy, but we need to assure that that information is going to be used in the most proactive and empowering way, and not used to undermine the history of Black history, where it came from, which I think is the struggle right now, and will probably continue to be a struggle as long as we live.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll get to some of the other questions that have come in from our audience, which is a very engaged and enthusiastic audience, which is always wonderful. So thank you to everybody who's been engaging in the chat and the Q&As. I just have one more question about commemorating Juneteenth and how to celebrate it. I think, and speaking for myself, I think that many white Americans are unsure about how to celebrate or commemorate Juneteenth appropriately. Do you have, either of you have any advice or insight into ways that people can celebrate, commemorate, memorialize this history? And I think you touched on it a little bit already, but if you could just put some advice out there for folks in the audience.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. I first learned about Juneteenth when probably I was 8 or 9. My mom is from Houston, Texas, and for some reason she felt it was a good idea to send us there every August for a month. Thank you, Mom. So we spent a great amount of time, half the time indoors, reading and staying out of the heat. But she was in she was from Houston's 3rd Ward, where my grandmother lived. And she was 2 blocks away from Emancipation Park, which, as far as I know, was the first kind of public space brought about by African Americans in Houston as a gathering point around the celebration of Juneteenth. As a side note, my mother graduated from Jack Yates High School, which was right across the street from where she lived. And that's the school George Floyd went to as well. So growing up, anytime I heard, even here in Maryland, someone mentioned Juneteenth, 9 times out of 10, the chance was that they were Texans. And so that holiday has traveled with Texans as they've gone across the country. How to celebrate it? White folks should celebrate it the same way that Black folks do. And that is, I would say, join in festivities. Easiest way to do it is a Google search, Juneteenth events near me. And you'll see some of them are new, some of them are historical and go back a ways. Some have more festive and celebratory events to them, and some are history based. So just look locally. Some people celebrate by joining a Book of the Month club, something with an emancipation theme. Rick gave some really great ideas, which would be great to have as a book group topic. Visiting historical sites would be great. But I would really strongly use it as a call for people to talk to the diversity of people they know. Have this conversation with your Black friends and your white friends, if we're allowed to say that, and all of your friends, and perhaps even create your own traditions.
I don't have much to add. That's a wonderful answer, Tony. I struggle with this, and I think we'll all gain some clarity as we become more familiar with this holiday and how it's asserted itself in popular culture. The word I tend to use is commemorate. The word you tended to use in your answer was celebrate, and there's some space between those two, some overlap, but also some space between those two words. Then I wonder where the nation will come down 10 years. Is this an opportunity for solemnity or for exhilaration? I really don't know. Slavery is a very serious topic, and ending slavery is a very serious topic, but it was the culmination of a process that led to the liberation from an economic institution, from a legal institution of millions of people. That is a joyous occasion, but whether getting mattresses at a discount emerges as the way to commemorate this event remains to be seen. I fear the worst.
Thanks, Rick, for my laugh out loud moment of the morning. That was nicely done. I am going to pull from a couple of folks who asked questions throughout the course of the program. We cannot talk about all of this in just 1 hour. It's not enough time, but I appreciate, squishing this into a 60-minute program. I'm going to grab a question from Nicole, who talked a little bit about Lincoln, and both of you talked about Lincoln as well. And she's wondering, curious to know if you think that the dialogue about Lincoln will ever change to reflect the fact that he was not a man who outwardly hated slavery and didn't really even seem concerned about Black people in general. So, Tony, I know you talked a little bit about the statue, which I think is very symbolic of what Nicole is alluding to. But Rick, perhaps do you have anything to talk about that, that dialogue and that perception of Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, Nicole, thanks for that complicated and well thought out question there. So Lincoln's reputation is constantly in flux. Historians are constantly reinterpreting the past, sharing their findings with the American reading public, and that's all to the good, right? No interpretation of a figure as important and transformative as Lincoln should ever be frozen in stone, frozen in marble. And I do want to say, folks, for folks who don't know much about Lincoln, he's a much more complicated figure than we sometimes give him credit for, even when it comes to slavery, as Nicole alluded to. If you know one thing about Lincoln, it's that Lincoln freed the slaves. He's the great emancipator, right? And there's certainly some truth to that, right? The Emancipation Proclamation is a monumental pivot point in American history because it's followed up by the actions of the US Army, et cetera, in the way we talked about. But Lincoln is not and was not a saint or a superhero. He was flesh and blood and flawed like all of us. And as I mentioned in passing at the start here, by the standards of members of his own party, the Republican Party, as well as anti-slavery activists outside of Washington, his racial politics were relatively conservative by the standards of 1860 when he was elected. I said he'd never joined an abolitionist organization. He thought they were too strident and shouty. He never condemned slaveholders as inveterate sinners, as Garrison and Douglas did every day of their lives. He never endorsed defiance of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. He never opened his home to freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. He was very skeptical for much of his life as to the political and civil equality to which African Americans were entitled. For much of his life, he regarded African Americans as his perpetual inferiors. He didn't think Black people and white people could ever really live together as equals or intermarry. For much of his life, he was skeptical about Black men gaining the right to vote or even sit on juries. He made jokes about, as he called them, darkies. He sometimes used the N-word. And if that all sounds like, my God, Lincoln's just terrible, I do want to just counterbalance that by saying this is the same president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This is the same president who is planning the 13th Amendment, which will be ratified after he is murdered, by the way. And this is the same president whose ideas about many of the things I just laid out will change in the course of the Civil War, when he starts listening to free Black leaders like Frederick Douglass, and when he sees what ordinary Black civilians, many of them former slaves, are capable of when they strap on a Union musket and put on a blue uniform. What is intoxicating about Lincoln, what I love about Lincoln, is his capacity for change when presented with evidence and opportunity. So we need to keep all these things in mind, right? History and mythology are not the same things. History and nationalism are not the same things. Historians are interested constantly in complexity, and there's no more complex figure in American history than Abraham Lincoln.
Thank you. I am going to ask one more question. Sadly, that's all we have time for. And Tony, I think maybe I'll direct this to you at the start, but Rick, feel free to add on. There was a comment about this kind of matrilinear approach to manumission, which one of our guests in the audience found to be really interesting. They're wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, if you can talk a little bit about if enslaved women were more likely to be freed or enslaved longer than men, if there's any correlation that you might be able to talk about.
Yes, I am sure that you can find more than one historian who has pinned their PhD on just this topic and has stats and whatnot to support it. But I would just say in general, in terms of mobility, in terms of, I'm cautious to say this, but resellable skill sets, that male enslaved people had higher mobility, a greater deal of social power within the slave system, and commanded higher dollars on the auction block, and may have had, based on those reasons, the cutting edge when it came to seizing or claiming one's own freedom. Women were the epicenter of I was going to say plantation culture, but really the slave society. And early on, states such as Maryland and Virginia adopted laws basically controlling the fate of future generations through the bodies of enslaved women. So those were amongst the earliest slave codes that the condition of the offspring followed the condition of the mother.
Thank you. So I'm going to wrap up our program. Thanks to everybody. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about all of the nuances and pieces of this really important and complex history. I do, however, before we close up, I do want to mention that there are a number of Juneteenth celebrations and commemorations happening throughout the state this weekend. On Saturday, the city of Annapolis is hosting their second annual Juneteenth parade and festival. The parade will begin at the Annapolis City Dock, which is not only home to the Alex Haley Memorial, but is also a designated UNESCO Middle Passage Site of Remembrance, in case you didn't know that, which indicates the role of Annapolis Port as a destination for the trade of human cargo. Another event that caught my eye is at the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. They're hosting a Juneteenth celebration on Monday, June 20th. It's an Education as Liberation program. There will be a number of activities, including a conversation about grilling. There was some conversation in the chat about food and its significance in Black communities as a Juneteenth tradition. And then later in their program, they'll be speaking with the sculptor Oletha Devane, whose memorial to those enslaved and freed was recently installed at the McDonough School. And then if those aren't enough for you, you can also attend the Afrim Festival in Druid Park here in Baltimore City, where I will be, because it's just really fun and it's my favorite park in the city. And anyway, so thank you, Rick. Thank you, Tony. There was also a question about whether this program was recorded and whether all of those useful and other exploratory resources that Rick and Tony mentioned will be available. The answer is yes. I will be sending a follow-up email with some of those sources for you all to explore in further detail, in addition to a recording of this program. So thank you, Rick and Tony, for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who tuned into the program. Take care and happy Juneteenth.